Hi everybody, let's talk about the issues of rural settlements in HICs. So over here, I've split things into three columns: the issues, the solutions to try to tackle the issues, and any evaluation of these solutions. So one of the biggest issues currently in HIC rural areas is the changes in agriculture. So agriculture is one of the main economy in rural areas. It's the main source of source of income for a lot of people in rural areas. And changes include the mechanization, which is the introduction of machinery into farming, and also larger farm sizes from richer and wealthier farmers buying up the land of poorer farmers. What this results in is unemployment and also lower wages, which means it's not possible to live in rural areas unless you find another source of income. And this comes from diversification. Diversification is basically just finding other things to do to earn money. And you see a rise in tourism in rural areas, for example, and also unconventional products, for example, goat milk instead of cow milk. However, there's a problem of oversupply. Diversification, like agriculture, is limited. If you have too much of something, the prices are going to go down because you have an oversupply. And what this means is you're going to go back to your low wages unless you find something new. So keep in mind that there's always a time constraint that you have to be ahead of the time, and also you have to switch before it's too late and you earn no money again. Rural depopulation is another big issue, and it often occurs in a cycle. So it starts off with economically active adults migrating to the cities for better job opportunities. This not only decreases your population, but also it decreases your age and your fertility in the area, possibly below the replacement level. And what this does is you have less births and your population will continuously decline. But the lower population leads to a decline in services because there's less demand for anything. And therefore your services close down, your shops, your schools close down, and this lowers the quality of life for those living in the rural areas, and then that encourages more people to migrate, being push factors, and you get a cycle of that depopulation. To try to combat this, you can try to encourage or incentivize counter-urbanization, and this happens in the UK primarily through green belts. Green belts are basically circular rings around cities where they are not allowed to sprawl and expand. What this allows for is metropolitan villages, which are rural areas next to urban areas. It allows the migration from the urban area to the rural area without the urban area engulfing the rural area. However, there are obviously issues that come with counter-urbanization. If you watch my video there, you would know. But also the inequality. Not all rural areas are the same, and counter-urbanization primarily occurs in metropolitan villages, as I said, outside the green belt. Where you have rural depopulation, it's generally the areas that's quite isolated and have a deteriorating quality of life and economy, which means that they're not really cared for because they're isolated. So therefore, you don't get too much of the counter-urbanization because if you have deteriorating services in one area, you don't really get people going there. So that's an issue with the inequality of rural areas, and that's why counter-urbanization does not always fix rural depopulation. Service decline is also another issue, and this occurs through the appearance of supermarkets. So supermarkets are large lots, and when they come to rural areas, they compete with farmers, but the farmers can't compete with the price that supermarkets provide for the consumers. And what this means is they get kicked out. They just can't find income, and this means the farmer services are gone, and also the internet. Right now you can basically do almost everything on the internet. You can find a job, you can study, you can get delivery services, you can do anything, you can do banking services even. So with that, there's less demand for the physical stores and services in the rural areas, and therefore you get a decline in that. What you can do to try to fix this is by establishing key villages. Key villages or key settlements are areas with high concentrations of basically everything. There's good accessibility, you have a lot of services, you have a good economy, you have a lot of infrastructure. And what this means is they function as a hub for nearby villages and rural areas to use the services there. So you don't need to have services everywhere and use up a lot of money. However, there's an issue of accessibility. Rural areas are often not too close to each other, but also the roads are not that well developed, and the infrastructure to get to these places are not that well developed as well, decreasing your accessibility. So if you want to travel to an area to use a service, there's migration, I guess, issues with that, the time and the money to actually get there. The next thing also links to this accessibility issue is transportation. 1 in 5 in the UK rural households lack a car, and this means they can't really get to much places, especially key villages. And what this does is it puts pressure on the poor people to um, buy a car and therefore become even poorer because cars are expensive and the gas prices are expensive as well, which widens your inequality. So what you can try to do to fix this is by funding transport, specifically public transport. But this comes with an opportunity cost. Opportunity cost is basically the trade-off. So if you're funding public transport in rural areas, you're missing out on the money being sent to urban areas to better the urban area. And obviously, rural areas are smaller in population, and therefore the money you put there won't generate too much of a return compared to that if you put that in urban areas. So that's something governments have to consider, whether they want to fund public transport in rural areas when it doesn't really have much productive use. Unaffordable housing is also another issue, and this is shown in the UK with 12% of rural houses being subsidized by the government compared to 25% for urban houses. This means that the burden on rural people, the financial burden on rural people for buying a house is much more higher than urban people, and this means that it's unaffordable compared to urban areas, which might drive your depopulation and migration. What you can do is build social housing, so government subsidized housing, and prevent private developers to buy the land and buy the houses and then spike up the price. But again, you get the opportunity cost of building the house in the first place. Is it really worth it building houses there when it doesn't generate too much of a return? Last thing is second homes. Second homes are second homes generally for urbanites who come over to rural areas in the holidays to relax. And there are positives and negatives. Positives, there are jobs not only from the construction, but also the urbanites might hire people to manage like gardening or cleaning the house. You get increased tax income from property tax and just tax from the person being at the place and spending their money. So obviously if they're there, they're going to spend their money, but also you get urban contacts. This means if any rural people want to migrate to urban areas, they already have someone that they're in contact with, the urbanites, to get there. So it reduces the constraint of migration, which is a positive for the migrants. However, there are negatives as well. Pollution and environmental degradation is one of the most important one. Obviously, you have deforestation for the flat land or for building materials. You have land pollution from the construction itself, but you also get visual pollution because these second homes are generally more modern compared to the traditional old rural houses, and therefore you get a divide that is not really aesthetically pleasing, and that is one of the pollution. Like, for example, another pollution is the overexploitation of resources. With more people in your rural areas, that puts an increased pressure on your resources like water resources or food resources, and that might force the rural areas to unsustainably extract the resources, which might degrade the environment. Additionally, you might get higher prices because these people are much more wealthier and have higher incomes than the rural people. So they can buy expensive houses, they can buy expensive land, but this means the rural people will drive up their prices and therefore other rural people can't really buy the things. Therefore, higher prices might um, negate any benefits, financial benefits such as jobs and money. Last thing is conflicts. Obviously, urban people and rural people have very different expectations and attitudes to social life. So with this contrast, there might be conflicts, and that might ruin the livelihood and the communication with other people in rural areas. It destroys the standard of living. So this sums up the issues of rural settlements in HICs. I hope you guys enjoyed, and I'll see you in the next video.